In our last segment, we learned how transitioning Mormons face cultural practices that are confusing as they try to connect with the new church. And that happens in even the best, most healthy congregations. It's just part of the cultural journey. But churches can also needlessly erect barriers by thoughtless practices or by unhealthy patterns in congregational life. So we want to talk about some of the things that churches can do to make it harder for Latter-day Saints to become enfolded in their life. The number one is when a church has a derogatory attitude toward Mormonism. How a church talks about Mormonism can go a long way toward making former Mormons feel either welcome or unwanted. Because when members or leaders speak in a negative tone about Mormonism, the transitioning Mormon is going to feel like they just aren't wanted there. They might feel inferior or stupid for having been a Mormon. And as they check out a new church, here's one question that's predominant in their mind often is, am I safe here? Or is this going to be a safe place where I could bring my brother, where I could bring my mom? And so that overall tone of the church can make a former Mormon feel personally belittled, even if they agree with you about Mormonism, even if they never really want to go back. It still feels personal. It feels like an obstacle. Now, a second obstacle can be when a church is insensitive toward former Mormons. What I'm talking about is this. When former Mormons come, church members can be guilty, even unwittingly, of several insensitive responses. The first one is to treat people as a curiosity. See, maybe they've never met a former Mormon before. They want to put maybe the former Mormon under the spotlight. They might ask embarrassing or impertinent questions to the former Mormon. That's off-putting. Nobody wants to be treated like a curiosity. Or they might be just a lack of empathy. It might not be anybody's fault, but members just don't get the issues that former Mormons are facing. And so they wonder why these people aren't making more progress, why they don't seem to understand where their hesitations come from, because they haven't walked in their shoes. And sometimes there's even an unwarranted suspicion or mistrust. The unspoken assumption is that because a person was Mormon at some point, that they can't be trusted, that even though they don't believe that anymore, that somehow they're tainted. They shouldn't be given any influence. They shouldn't be given any responsibility in the life of the church. And you could probably identify other ways as you watch for ways that people in the church can be insensitive toward people from an LDS background. Now, here's another obstacle that often churches throw in their way, and that is impatience with the person's transition. See, the truth can be clear to us, and so we expect it to be clear for everybody else. We trust and believe the Bible, and so we wonder why other people don't or can't. We understand key topics. We get impatient with people who don't understand those things or don't seem to want to understand those things because we easily forget the emotional dynamics that are driving the former Mormons' experience. And then finally, there's a whole category of obstacle that I'm calling unhealthy church dynamics. Now, some expressions of congregational life just are not healthy, and every church would benefit from evaluating these things, evaluating themselves for these things. But I want to point out three attitudes or practices that really aren't healthy for anybody, but they're especially toxic for former Mormons. The first one is authoritarian leadership. Here's some of the symptoms of that. It's when the pastor has no accountability structure, or when that pastor is not answerable to anybody inside or outside of the church. When a pastor says, just trust me, just believe me, expects people to believe them because they're the pastor. But you see, former Mormons are coming out of an authoritarian religious system. And so autocratic or domineering leadership can be very toxic for former Mormons. Now, a second unhealthy attitude or practice in some churches is legalism or lack of grace. See, I'm defining legalism as the approach to God that emphasizes external actions or visible practices as a measure of who's right with God. And especially often in legalistic systems, that approval is measured by standards that go beyond what the Bible has to say. And what happens often also is that legalistic systems express a tremendous lack of grace to people who don't measure up to those standards. Now, legalism is a hallmark of Mormon culture, but it isn't limited to Mormonism at all. Many churches suffer from legalism. And often I've seen former Mormons tend to gravitate toward legalistic churches because they want the security of knowing where they stand, because they're used to having this external checklist, and they don't know how yet to measure their growth internally. But what they need from us as a church is to learn how to live in God's grace and to extend God's grace to others. And so a legalistic church environment is very unhelpful and damaging for former Mormons. And then the third area, a third kind of behavior that churches engage in that's just not helpful is when churches are unloving and critical and backbiting. Because churches, you know this, they can be a breeding ground for criticism and gossip, and that's clearly unhealthy for people who are fragile in their faith journey, who might easily become targets of disapproval and speculation. And so as these unhealthy conditions are present in a church, that church is not ready to enfold former Mormons. It's not healthy enough to do so. And so if your church wants to disciple former Mormons on their journey to faith, then I would say that taking all these obstacles into account, that it's really your responsibility to do what you can to adapt to newcomers rather than asking newcomers to do all the work to adapt to you. And so I want to encourage you and your leadership team to think about how can we make this difficult journey as encouraging as possible, and how can we take the initiative as a church to reduce the obstacles.